Greetings to all of our listeners. I'm Ken Samples. I work as a senior scholar here at Reasons to Believe, and I want to welcome all of you to our RTB Scholar Community live stream. Our topic for today is Human Origins and Christianity, a dialogue between Reasons to Believe and the Center for Creation Studies. At RTB, we believe very much in the golden rule of apologetics, and that simply means we endeavor to treat other people's beliefs the way we want ours treated. That would involve respect. It would be treating other people's beliefs accurately and in a fair-minded manner. And over this year, we have had a number of what I would call bridge-building opportunities. We talked with Josh Swamidas of Peaceful Science, Casey Luskin at the title there is the Discovery Institute. Thank you, Fuzz. And we also talked with William Lane Craig at Reasonable Faith. And today we have a great opportunity to continue that discussion. And I want to tell you a little bit about how the program will go forth before I introduce our guests. There'll be 3 parts. The first part will be about 20 minutes, and we'll introduce the 2 organizations. We'll talk a little bit about the Christian worldview, how it applies. Part 2 will be 45 minutes to discuss human origins and Christianity. And then part 3 will be your opportunity. About 30 minutes, you can put in some questions, and they will put them in the chat box. They will be relayed to me, and I will pass them on to our guests. So let me go ahead and introduce our 2 guests. We have Dr. Fuz Rana. He's a leading evangelical scientist, and he writes on science faith issues. Fuz, I think you've written 10 books.
Something like that, yeah.
The book that would be very appropriate, Who Was Adam, I think would apply. You're a biochemist by training, and you serve as the president of Reasons to Believe. So we're glad to have you here.
Thank you, Ken.
We also have Dr. Marcus Ross. Dr. Ross is also a leading evangelical scientist. He writes on science faith issues. You are a paleontologist by training, I believe. Mm-hmm. You work as a fellow at the Center for Creation Studies, and that's at Liberty University.
Correct.
But you're also a professor of geology, and then you have some other work that you perform. You're the CEO of Cornerstone Educational Supply, which provides science materials for homeschoolers, K-12 schools, and universities. And then you have a earth science textbook, I believe, and the title is The Heavens and the Earth.
Yes, that's right.
Welcome to our program. It is such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much, Ken. Thank you, Fuzz, for bringing me along. It's a wonderful opportunity to be here and to engage in dialogue and to be part of this series of, as you said, bridge building. Thank you so much.
Well, Marcus and I really just want to say I appreciate your willingness to travel here to the Reasons to Believe offices, to take the time to be with us. So thank you for doing that.
You're most welcome.
Well, very good. Let's start with our part 1 here, and maybe we could talk a little bit about the 2 organizations. Maybe, Fuzz, maybe you could kind of succinctly describe the mission here at RTB.
Yeah, well, Reasons to Believe is a science faith organization, and even though we're involved in apologetics, our primary emphasis is really evangelism. We want to engage people who are far from Christ with the scientific evidence for the Christian faith and equip people in the church to do likewise. So our purpose at Reasons to Believe is to open people to the gospel by revealing God in science.
Very good. Marcus, now, would you be speaking for your organization or for yourself? How would you what would be the mission statement?
Sure. So in 2 respects, as you said, I'm a fellow with the Center for Creation Studies at Liberty University, and I served as a professor of geology at Liberty from 2005 to 2021. So 16 years at Liberty University before I stepped down to become the full-time CEO of Cornerstone. In representing the Center for Creation Studies here, and I served as director of that for several years, the Center for Creation Studies exists in order to present students at the school and to expand out and present to other audiences more broadly a case for a young Earth creation perspective of Earth history and biblical understandings. And while I was there, we taught courses, we hosted seminars, things like that. For Cornerstone Educational Supply, we are a very distinctly Christian company in our orientation, but we're happy to work with public schools, private schools, whatever, in just providing them with good materials. I wanted our company to have a mission mindset of being able to support Christians in science and science-faith dialogue through our company. People need stuff. My wife likes to call us the stuff company. So when people need science supplies, part of what we are all about at Cornerstone is funneling some of our profits into organizations that can help with good dialogue.
Excellent. That sounds like a great place to get material. Well, let's talk about the Christian worldview. Gentlemen, one way of summarizing kind of a classical Christian worldview is to talk about 4 successive cosmic events: creation, fall, redemption, consummation. Maybe we could begin with some preliminary comments, and that would be, do the 2 organizations affirm a Trinitarian Christian theism? Is that held by both of the organizations?
Definitely.
Yes, absolutely.
And how about the biblical authority and biblical inerrancy? Is that also a position that both of the organizations would affirm?
Yep.
Yep. Liberty University specifically affirms inerrancy in its doctrine and statement of faith.
Yeah, and RTB does as well. And in fact, we hold to the Chicago Statement on biblical inerrancy.
Right. Mm-hmm. Well, excellent. Those doctrines are right at the heart of classical Christianity, the Trinity, and of course, the ultimate authority of Scripture and its inerrancy. Let's talk a little bit about that first cosmic event, creation. And here I think to myself, how about the doctrine of creation ex nihilo? Simply, the triune God existed, called all other contingent realities into existence from or by nothing. Fuzz?
Yes, most definitely. And this is one place that has been kind of the bread and butter of reasons to believe, is not only do we hold to this idea of creation ex nihilo, but we see Big Bang cosmology and the space-time theorems of relativity being incredibly profound scientific insights that suggest strongly that the universe had a beginning, affirming this biblical idea.
Okay, Marcus.
For Liberty University, their doctrinal statement does affirm creation ex nihilo and creation in 6 days. For Liberty University, that's broadly understood within a young Earth creation perspective, and so different from RTB in that Liberty, and especially the Center for Creation Studies, would not affirm a Big Bang cosmology, but nonetheless that the entirety of creation, as you said, contingent upon just the magnificence of God and his own volition to create, that he was under no compulsion to do so, but did so of his own desires to create things that he could then love.
Great. An affirmation of a historical Adam and Eve.
Yes, I mean, that's a central idea of our creation model at Reasons to Believe, is not only that was there a historical Adam and Eve, but Adam and Eve were the first human beings made in God's image, in that they are the sole ancestors or the sole progenitors of all human beings that are not only alive today, but have been alive throughout the entirety of human history.
So RTB would affirm an old universe, an old Earth,
Right.
but would reject evolution in the sense.
Yeah, I wouldn't say reject, but we are highly skeptical of certain aspects of the evolutionary paradigm, that we would reject the idea that evolutionary mechanisms alone can solely account for the totality of biology, that there are very clear places not only where evolutionary theory seems to break down, but these are also places where we would argue we see a creator's handiwork or fingerprint.
Marcus, historical Adam and Eve, a young Earth.
Yes. So for the Center for Creation Studies, and again for Liberty University's doctrinal statement, that is very specific in stating that Adam and Eve were directly created by God miraculously, and that they were the first of all human beings. And so we would likewise say that there were no other human beings created alongside them. It was just those two. The entire human population from the very first two to today all descends from Adam and Eve. And moreover, that there were no other creatures or peoples that looked sort of like humans but were not humans. So one slight difference in being a young Earth creationist is that we don't have other organisms that would predate humans that might be considered something like us, but not. So a very strong, I would say in some senses, a stronger distinction between the animal creation and human creation. And that'll be part of the discussion that we're going to have today about where we draw those lines and why.
Now, regarding the creation days themselves, Christians have taken different positions. Fuzz, what's the general view of RTB's approach to the creation days?
Well, we look at Genesis 1 as being, Genesis 1 through 11 as being historical, right? So Genesis 1 is a divine natural history where the events that are being described in the successive days of creation are, maybe you could say, highlights of what God did, that there's a lot of information that the text doesn't communicate to us about what God did, but we could see the days as highlights, but we would understand the days as being epochs or periods of time. But again, we see it as a divine natural history where the days are organized in a chronological manner.
Okay, Marcus, describe your perspective or the organization's perspective on how you interpret the creation days.
Yeah, so our perspective as Young Earth Creationists, and so for the Center for Creation Studies in Liberty University, the perspective is that the days of creation are describing days more or less as we experience them, roughly 24-hour periods of time governed by periods of light and darkness that reflect actual light and actual darkness, not just like a beginning or ending of a period. And so we look at that perspective, and which can be traced all the way back to Theophilus of Antioch as one of, in fact, the earliest Christian commentator on Genesis, who took the position that the days of creation were literal days in that respect. It doesn't take too long before you find others, such as of Augustine and even before that, that you find other perspectives of analogical views or things like that. But at least the position that we take at the Center for Creation Studies is one that we can follow back a long distance in the history of the church.
Very good. Let's shift then to the fall. Do both of the organizations affirm what I would call an in time and space fall? And what's the thought about original sin?
Yeah, well, at Reasons to Believe, we do believe that there was a fall, right? And it was a real event that had ramifications for our relationship as human beings with God, with others, with the creation itself. This is why the idea of a historical Adam, in my mind, is so critical, because without a historical Adam, it's very difficult to then understand how all human beings would be impacted by Adam's sin unless we were all ancestors of Adam and Eve, that we all are in Adam in that sense. So we would affirm, again, a real-time fall in space and time, and the concept of original sin that was propagated to all people who are Adam's descendants.
Okay, Marcus, how about you and the organization you represent?
Yeah, we would be in full and complete agreement. Adam and Eve's sin happened in time and space, and was a particular event that had reverberations not only for them spiritually, but also with respect to the world around them. That is, was, as you said, a cosmic event. One that actually affects, for us as Young Earth Creationists, perhaps in a stronger way, affects the entirety of the created world than perhaps it does in an Old Earth perspective. Again, something we'll kind of talk about here today. But yes, from this, Fuzz and I are both in perfect agreement as we're reading through Romans 5 or 1 Corinthians 15 and going, yeah, that connection point between Adam's sin and Jesus' redemption is a fixed necessity, I think, for the Christian faith.
Very good. We'll move to the third cosmic event, redemption. So here we're looking at things like Christ's two natures, that he is the God-man, his life, death, and resurrection, salvation by grace. Fuzz?
Yeah, I mean, that we would affirm the idea of the incarnation and that Christ is truly human, truly divine. And it's because of his dual nature that he's able to bridge that relationship between a fallen human beings and a holy God through his sacrifice on the cross. We believe that he rose, of course, bodily from the dead, and that is something that can be powerfully demonstrated historically. I think your colleague Gary Habermas has done masterful work towards that end, and that we believe that it's through Christ's death on the cross and that alone that we have salvation. There's nothing we can do on our own to earn God's favor. It's a gift that's been given to us.
Marcus.
Amen. Not much to add there. Yes, a full affirmation of Jesus's natures as fully God and fully man. Being able to go with the Nicene Creed, the Apostles' Creed.
I like that.
But recognizing that the one thing that we need is just the thief on the cross, an affirmation. You are Lord. Remember me, when you come into your kingdom. So, Liberty University and RTB would be in very strong agreement. It's one of the things that I was telling a church group just the other day as I was walking them through a timeline and a history of how we came to have so many different perspectives within Christendom and within evangelicalism on these topics, is that Young Earth Creationists and Old Earth Creationists here, we're the cousins at the family gathering. We see each other a lot. And that's one of the reasons why sometimes we've argued so, hard with one another, is because we're in the same family. And we often don't end up arguing quite as much, or at least quite as passionately, sometimes with perspectives that are further out, because, we're not in the same churches, rubbing elbows with one another, where, Fuzz and I would be probably perfectly comfortable being in the same denomination, in the same chapel, taking communion together. That's just one of those things. We're affirming a lot of these things in concert as evangelicals who affirm inerrancy. That puts us in the family, really close together.
Well, Marcus, little story, and I don't know even if you remember this interchange we had, but we were last year at the Evangelical Theological Society meeting. There was an event that was featuring the book that you're one of the contributors to, and I had an opportunity to play a small role as a respondent. And then afterwards, I saw Marcus in the hall, and I just said, Marcus, I want to make sure you know that I really agreed with quite a bit that was in your chapter. And you made the point that we actually are operating in the same hermeneutical framework, that even though we see Genesis 1 through 11 very differently in terms of the interpretation, the methodology we're using is the same methodology, which actually means there's a real opportunity for engagement versus other prominent evangelical scholars who are dealing with the issue of the historical Adam, who are approaching Genesis 1 through 11 through a very different hermeneutical lens.
Yeah, I think that was something I appreciated you mentioning last year when we met up. And yeah, you had mentioned earlier a historical grammatical approach to Genesis, and that's exactly also what a Young Earth Creationist position is. And so Young Earth and Old Earth Creationists grew together with this conservative approach of reading the Bible the way that we believe the original audience was intended to understand it. Right? Yeah. It's a message from God that should be interpreted according to their world and sought for applications to our own. And that's why a Presbyterian church, a Baptist church, Assemblies of God church might have Young Earth and Old Earth Creationists all there, shoulder to shoulder in there. Because when it comes down to it, once you and I get to Abraham, we're pretty much in lockstep, on a lot of issues, certainly on the historical questions. Yeah. And it really comes down to then, what are the finer instances of how do we interpret the days of creation or the extent of the flood or where we place Adam in human history, and how does science influence the way that we might have interpretive options within a historical grammatical approach. Yeah.
I think that's a really good insight, that maybe the clash that comes out from time to time is there because we have a lot of agreement on other things. I appreciate you making that point. Okay, the fourth cosmic event is Consummation. I like to talk about consummation in terms of what I call mere Christian eschatology. I mean, there's amillennial, postmillennial, premillennial viewpoints, but I see mere Christian eschatology as involving the second coming, the resurrection, the judgment, the new creation, the eternal state. Mere Christian eschatology at Reasons to Believe, Fuzz?
Yes, of course. Yeah. And, to me, I don't think a whole lot about the consummation aspect of the faith. Maybe that's to my failing. But the one thing that I do have enormous amount of hope in is not only Christ's return, but really what awaits us, the promise that awaits us as believers, which is entering into that new creation and being in that face-to-face,
Beatific vision.
that face-to-face experience with Christ.
Marcus?
Well, Liberty University historically held to a premillennial, pre-tribulation position. As the university has grown and expanded, that position is not required of all the faculty and staff, although it is required of those who teach in the School of Divinity. So that's the faith tradition, and for myself, mostly I simply affirm, even so come Lord Jesus, and that coming is physical, it is cosmic, it will bring an ultimate rule and reign and a new Jerusalem that comes down from the heavenly city, the new heavens, the new earth. So for my part, I paid a lot more attention to what was going on in the first few chapters of the Bible. Amazed and mesmerized and mystified by the last book of the Bible. And so, even so, come Lord Jesus.
Amen.
Cornerstone takes no particular opinions on this one. So,
Let's shift to part 2, human origins. Maybe this first question, and I think we're doing it right here, but the question is, even with our agreements and disagreements, can the two camps work together? I think we're involved with that here. Is there any other ways you could foresee the two organizations working together?
This is interesting because I'm not so sure that in the past that question would even be raised, and I'm hopeful that Young Earth and Old Earth Creationists can work together, particularly when it comes to questions of biological origins. I mean, I think both Marcus and I would agree that there really is bona fide design in biochemical and biological systems that it reflects the handiwork of a creator, that there are very real challenges to naturalistic evolutionary explanations for at least key transitions in life's history at minimum. And I think there's, we were chatting a couple months ago maybe about this whole idea of how to look at the way in which organisms are classified, right? And how does God create? And I see God creating core designs that then vary through evolutionary processes, which is very similar, I think, to ideas that are traditionally under the umbrella of baraminology. So I think Marcus and I were saying this may actually be a place where an Old Earth and Young Earth creationists could work together in terms of really trying to delineate what is that core design that God is implementing, in that then has that quote unquote freedom to vary in response to selection and other types of evolutionary mechanisms that would fall under the umbrella of microevolution.
Marcus?
Yeah, it was a really good Zoom call that we had where we were, just kind of feeling out if this was going to be a good thing for us to do, and then talking about that issue of biological design. It's an area where Young Earth Creationists, I think, have actually been working for a very long time with a lot of different methodologies because affirming as we do that God created according to kinds. Now, that word for kind in Hebrew, min, I think is a very general term. It's used in a lot of different ways throughout the Bible. So I'm not looking at min, a kind, as a specific taxonomic unit. But it does seem that God created according to some set of units. And the methodologies of what we call baraminology, and what that means is the Hebrew word for create, when God does creating, is bara. The Hebrew word for kind is min, so we have created kinds. We throw an ology on it to let people know that we're doing a study or science or whatever. Yeah. But Young Earth Creationists have developed a number of different methodologies from observations of breeding experiments amongst living organisms. If two organisms are able to hybridize, for example, that might be a key indicator that they are actually part of the same kind and descended from an original, in our view, pair of animals that was brought on board the ark. But even from an Old Earth perspective, I could see that you could, look at that even if they weren't on board the ark. If since you think the flood was a more localized event, these still might be organisms that share a created history of some sense with them. So Young Earth Creationists have worked on statistical methodologies, modern biological, experimental sorts of things, and I'm, for one, would welcome more and different types of methods to be brought to the table to see, have what we've found so far mesh with other methods when we're looking at fossil organisms and things like that. And in particular, Todd Wood and several others in my camp of Young Earth Creationism have been the leaders in developing these methodologies. And it's always been kind of curious to me over the past about 25 years that these methodologies weren't used in Old Earth or intelligent design circles, because they actually were, in a sense, quite theory neutral in that regard. Mm-hmm. They were allowing us to explore the data to find commonalities and distinctions. But I think in part because of all those sibling rivalries and cousin fights, you kind of look and say, well, we're not going to do whatever they're doing, and we're not going to do what they're doing. But here's an opportunity where I think we can come to the same table with our laptops open and crunch some data and see what we find.
Yeah.
Well, let me then shift first to you on this question, Marcus. Talk to us a little bit about maybe the distinctives of a young Earth view of historical Adam and Eve, and maybe include in that, what's the biblical case for Adam and Eve?
That's a big topic. As certainly Fuzz and Hugh have written an entire book, about Adam themselves, and we're, I'm in this one here. So from a young Earth creation perspective, as I mentioned, Adam and Eve are the first and sole progenitors for all humanity. And that there were no other similar types of creatures, non-souled hominids, for example, that would have looked sort of like them. There might have been some, apes, even maybe upright walking apes or what have you, but still physically rather distinct and different from them, so that when Adam looks around at the animals that God brings him to name, he sees that there is no match, right? That there's nothing like him. It says that he saw that God said it was not good that he would be alone. And so Adam names the animals and realizes there isn't anything out there that looks quite like me. And so God miraculously creates Eve from his rib. And of course, he wakes up with that beautiful poem in Hebrew saying, this is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. She should be called Ish, woman, because she was taken from Ish, man, right? So there's this lovely play on words, just like we have in English. And so Young Earth Creationists would then say, following the historical fall, in which they did eat from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, they were ejected from the garden, and that the curses on the serpent and the ground are reflective of the two responsibilities that human beings were given in Genesis 1, actually. And that was they were to subdue the earth and have dominion over the animals. And that represents them as the total masters over this particular creation, right? That, as I would tell my students, we're the managers of the business. We didn't create the business, we don't own it, but we were placed as the managers for that. Since steward is not a word we use a lot in modern English, my students could get, okay, manager, I worked at Wendy's, I get, there's a manager, right? And so those managers are responsible for the whole show, right? They're responsible for everything. And God describes that in the way of dominion and subduing. And what we see with their failure in the garden is that they failed to have dominion over the serpent and heeded his advice, and they failed to properly steward the world and tend the garden properly by eating the fruit. So when God curses, he never curses Adam and he never curses Eve. Praise God, because the curse that is used there is one that you don't get out from under. There's different words in Hebrew for curses. And one of my friends and colleagues said, you don't want this one. This is a bad one. So that curse is on the serpent. It says that he's cursed more than all cattle, more than all behemoth, more than all beasts of the field. And the ground is cursed. So in my view as a young earth creation, this tells me that the curse is extending into the entirety of creation. Such that now we have physical differences, physical changes that are occurring in the creation. It's not just our relationship to it. So then from Adam and Eve, we see how sin metastasizes so quickly to the point that their first son murders their second, and that the wickedness goes so great that eventually God decides that the human project is at an end and will destroy in our view, in the entire world, with a worldwide global flood. And so that trajectory through to a righteous one man, Noah, acts as, of course, the hinge point to ultimately getting to righteous Abram, who's going to be the seed as God decides, I'm not going to destroy humans, but I'm going to save them, and I'm going to do it through a man. So in a rough, quick outline from the 6 days of creation as normal days or days like we experience them, we can follow this genealogical flow and this historical flow over several thousands of years. I'm not going to pin myself to Archbishop Usher's 4004 BC. I think that we can have some flexibility there. But nonetheless, in my view, Earth's history and human history are entirely contemporaneous, save 5 days.
Now, Fuzz, how about your perspective? You're going to agree with some of that. You're going to disagree with some of that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a lot that Marcus said that I would agree with, and that we would hold to at Reasons to Believe. One point of distinction would be that we would see Adam and Eve as being anatomically and behaviorally modern humans, or Homo sapiens sapiens. So we do acknowledge that there are hominins that precede the appearance of Adam and Eve in the fossil record, but that we see them as being creatures that had some measure of intelligence, emotional capacity, but they lacked the image of God. And that I believe that if we interacted with them, we would actually recognize them as being fundamentally different from us. That there would be these noticeable differences, primarily in terms of their cognitive capacities. But again, so they are remarkable creatures. We would think of them in the same vein as we would think of orangutans, chimps, and gorillas, right? Creatures that have some similarity to us, but clearly are distinct from us or different from us. In terms of the Australopithecines and things like Paranthropus as a genus, we would probably agree very much with Young Earth Creationists that these were a distinct category separate from humans, right? But we would include other distinct categories like the habilines, the erectines, and what would be called in the scientific literature archaic Homo sapiens. We would see these as distinct clusters that are separate from modern humans, right? We would place the origin of Adam and Eve at about 150,000 years ago. That's where the scientific record seems to indicate where we see anatomically and behaviorally modern humans show up. We also see very unequivocal evidence for symbolism that is at about that point in time, which I see as a critical diagnostic for the image of God. We would argue that the genealogies in Genesis 5 through 11 are theological constructs, but they're not to be used as chronometers or timekeeping devices. And so for that reason, we would say Scripture is silent on when Adam and Eve were created. We really need to rely on the scientific evidence primarily to determine when Adam and Eve lived. But in terms of the description that Marcus gave of the fall, we would very much be in a line with that. I think we probably see the curse a little bit differently. I think it's interesting, Marcus, that you point out that the curse corresponds to the commands that we were given to fulfill as image bearers, right? We were to multiply and fill the earth. Now there's pain in childbirth, right? That we were to rule over the earth, and now it's going to be a lot of work to try to eat from the earth. And when it comes to this idea of the creation being cursed, we were to be stewards of the creation, or managers, as you say, and now the earth is going to be cursed because we are not going to be able to fulfill that responsibility. So what I see happening at the fall isn't that the creation changed, but rather that our relationship as human beings changed. Our relationship with God was fractured. Our relationship with other people is fractured. There's the mention of Adam and Eve now having this difficult relationship because of the fall. And then our relationship with creation has changed, so that, again, we can't be effective stewards, and as a result of that, we're going to do damage to the creation, so hence the creation is cursed. But I do see the curse of the serpent as being a direct curse that's God is placing on, in effect, Satan, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, some people think that an old earth point of view, like RTB, would affirm theistic evolution or evolutionary creationism, but RTB does not affirm that.
No, not at all. So we're not looking at things in an evolutionary sense whatsoever. We really are seeing the hominins as being creatures that God created, again, that are part of his handiwork. But this is where I think this idea of baraminology becomes important, because I would see God creating the Habilines or the Australopithecines, right, or the Erectines. But then within that, there is the possibility that there could be some speciation that takes place. So it's a combination of looking at the hominin fossil record as being, in effect, created kinds, if you will, but also having that freedom to evolve. With regard to the flood account, we would see the flood as a real event that impacted all of humanity, that we would argue that human beings hadn't migrated around the world, that we resisted the command that God gave to multiply and fill the earth. And even after the flood, there's still that resistance to fulfill that command to multiply and fill the earth. And so we see the scattering of humanity as being driven, in the confounding of language, as being driven by God in order to prevent this coalescence of human beings to rise up against God in that way. So I think we would see the flood, at least in theological terms, very similarly, if not in terms of the physical extent of the flood.
Sure. Yeah, and from a young Earth creation standpoint, I'll hit a couple of these things that you brought up. Our perspective on things like the Neanderthals and mid-Pleistocene Homo, like Homo heidelbergensis, or these different sorts of things, possibly even the Habilines, right? So we run our analyses in baraminology to kind of see in almost like dot plots or similarity plots who seems to be very physically similar to others. And that represents then a hypothesis of what those kinds might be. And then from there, we might have other ways to try to evaluate, who's in that. And that's one of the things I do in the book. I then look at anthropological record material of tool making or things like that as a way to check, are our clusters that might propose a group that are part of the humankind evidenced by other aspects of intellect that we associate with humans, for example. And so from a young Earth creation perspective, the different groups such as Homo erectus or the Neanderthals are part of the post-flood recolonization period. They're not preceding Adam and Eve. They're not alongside Adam and Eve. They are actually groups of people that arose after Noah's flood was done. And so our placement in geology is a little bit different, actually quite a bit different from, say, the RTB model or from theistic evolutionists, who are likewise frequently looking for Adam, if they think he exists, somewhere in Homo sapiens, with some notable differences like Bill Craig's view, putting it far down. So for us, we look at those hominins that we do think are human as being descendants of Adam and descendants of Noah, more specifically, in a post-flood world. Yes, I would say theologically we have a lot of similarities in our perspective on the flood, as it's intended to be, a complete wiping out of human beings. But I would also say theologically, one of our distinctions is just how cosmic the flood is. And I would say that the flood is a cosmic event in the same way that creation and Christ's ultimate return are cosmic, in that they affect the entirety of the universe. So that would be both a similarity. It affects all humans, but I think it affects the entire creation itself. Yeah.
I want to pick up on that, but I want to remind our listeners that you're going to get an opportunity to ask questions. You'll put it in the chat. Make sure it is a question and that it's concise, because we want to respond to it. Gentlemen, I'd like to come back a little bit to this death before the fall issue. That seems like that is a point of controversy. How the curse affected the world, the universe. Marcus, would you say then is the Young Earth viewpoint that there was no death of any kind until the fall, and so all of that comes post-fall?
That's a great question, and it's one that requires a little bit of thinking through on that, because there certainly were some forms of death prior to Adam and Eve's sin. For example, plants were given to be food for the animals and for people. And so it doesn't seem to me, at least, that God values plant life at the same economy that he values complex animal life and human life. The intention for plants is that they are to be food. And so while the Bible does refer to plants as being, living things or growing and producing, they are also not nephesh creatures, right? They don't have the breath of life in them. So I think a better approach for young earth creationism is to say that certainly there is death in there. The whole reason we have separated fingers rather than a big mitt is because there is a program in our body that says start to destroy and kill the cells that connect in between all of our fingers. Otherwise, we'd have this big web. That's called apoptosis, programmed cell death. But as I would tell my students, my finger, the cells in my finger are not me. The cell in my liver is not me. I am an organism. I am an entity, and that is the unit of death that God seems to be interested in for higher organisms and for humans. So the death of individual cells, we have skin cells that die, that's not a big deal because I, as an organism, I'm not dead, even if the cells are. And as to the question of animal death, that one has a long and complicated history, even in young earth creationism, that many young earth creationists aren't aware of. So many of us would think that with Adam and Eve's sin comes the physical death of humans. It would take a couple hundred years, but the physical death was a result of that. Many also believe that animal death is part of that as well, because we see that animals are given plants to eat on the sixth day. And I lean in that direction. That's definitely the way that I think makes a little better sense of the biblical text, but the text never says animals die at this point. And you can go back and read Augustine, and Augustine was fully happy with the idea that lions looked like lions before the fall, and that they ate other animals before the fall. Augustine, I would say, actually held to a young earth view, even though he held to an allegorical perspective on the days of Genesis 1. But his view of earth history is it began instantaneously with everything in Adam recently. And so prior to the fall, there's whatever time is there, and he thought that there was animal death. So within the history of views that held to a young earth, we see both. And I think it would be good for us in young earth creationism to leave those options somewhat open, because the New Testament is talking about human death in, say, Romans 5. But I do think that Romans 8 gives us a glimpse that the creation itself has been cosmically affected in the sin, and that groaning and travailing of the creation, that's one of those places that I look to in the New Testament and say, I think this is telling me that the creation is fundamentally broken, such that when I see those lions take down those zebras, there is something in me that I think looks at that and says, it's not right. There is a better way, and eschatologically looks forward to a better place.
Fuzz, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, we take the view that there was animal death prior to the fall. And I appreciate the point that you're making, Marcus, is that in young earth creationism, there's actually maybe a little less clean of a history in terms of that particular issue, and that's something that should remain at least loosely held. And when I look at the biblical text, for example, this is more of an inference, that the point that I'm going to make here is that Adam wasn't created in the garden. He was created, and then God caused the garden to grow. And he was placed in the garden and then given the command that, when you eat from this tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will die. On that day, you surely will die. Well, for Adam to have any concept of what that meant that he had to have experienced animal death prior to going into the Garden of Eden, which I see as a sacred place, as a protected place. But also that when you look at the Scriptures, there is no place in Scripture that it says there was no animal death prior to the fall. And I think that's the point you were making, Marcus, if I'm not putting words in your mouth. And then I look at passages like Psalm 104, Job 38, 39, which are these places where, there's a discussion of creation, and God is always being glorified and praised and celebrated because of his work as creator. And so in Psalm 104, there are two places where it's mentioning God is providing the prey for the predator, or that there is this cycle of life and death and rebirth that God is orchestrating, or Job 38 and 39, God is again being celebrated in being glorified and magnified because he is providing prey for the predators. So I see animal death as hard as it is for me to take, as being part of the original creation. And one question would be, well, why would God do that? And I think science gives us some insight that to have stable ecosystems, you've got to have, animals dying. You have to have plants dying. You have to have detrivores that are processing that, the dead material in order to release the nutrients into the environment. So that's a rationale. But I think there's even a deeper reason, because I see God the Creator, of course, as God the Redeemer. And I believe that God is revealed through the creation, but I think there's also redemptive analogies that are in the creation, including this idea of life coming from death, which is really the heart of the gospel, right? Mm-hmm. That it's through Christ's death that we gain eternal life. It's in our process of sanctification, we're dying to ourselves in order that we may live, right? And so the idea here is that this idea of life from death is the theme of the gospel. It's a theme that we see in creation. And so it makes sense to me that God would create a world with that in it, where it's good that death is horrifying to us, in the sense because it highlights just the brutality of what Christ experienced on the cross in order to die so that we could live.
Now, again, you would say that Romans 5 is about human death, but in Romans 8, it seems that death moves beyond humanity to kind of a cosmic perspective.
Yes, indeed. I think sometimes Young Earth Creationists have overreached a little bit on Romans 5 in talking about how death is brought into sin. And other theologians said, hey, that's talking just about humans. And that's one of those things that I think is correct on the technical points, but I think as we read through Romans and we see the effect of that sin on the rest of the world, that honestly the point of death amongst at least the nephesh organisms, these higher organisms, is a very reasonable inference to make from that passage, especially when we see that the whole earth is groaning and travailing in the pains of childbirth, which if you try and think, where do I hear about something that's under a curse and pain and childbirth, it brings you right back to Genesis chapter 3. That's the curse on the woman. But now Paul is applying that to the curse, not on the woman, but to all of creation is groaning and travailing. And it's waiting for the redemption of our bodies, right? Our physical resurrection, at which point this will actually be made right. So Paul is talking about something, I think, fundamental to the fabric of the universe that is broken. And I appreciate your perspective on things like Psalm 104 and Job 38 and 39. From a Young Earth perspective, because it's challenging when I read those and I see, God in his gracious hand is giving food to the young lions, right, and things like that, and to the carrion feeders and those sorts of animals that are doing dirty work here, right? This is rough stuff. As much as I cheered for them on the Mutual of Omaha, that'll go back for a few people. But I like my Discovery Channel stuff where the cheetah wins. I want to see it, but at the same time, it pains me. And I think when I'm looking at Psalm 104, I'm looking at those particular passages in Psalm 104 as the psalmist describing the world that they live in, right? This is the psalmist's world that there's talks about ships and wine and Lebanon and things like that. And I think he is looking at this world that is still good and still worth celebrating. And God still has his hand in doing all these things. And yet I see predation, especially, but broadly speaking, higher level animal death as something that is probably a necessity in a fallen world. but not a necessity in an unfallen world. To get to the question of, what happens to animals if they continue to reproduce and reproduce? Well, God told them to fill the earth. That actually kind of indicates that the earth has a certain level, and as the animals would get to that, perhaps, this is total speculation on my part, but perhaps they would know at what point their levels of population were appropriate in an unfallen world. And if we think of the sin of Adam and Eve, as many theologians have, as the introduction of selfishness, C.S. Lewis wrote about this pride and selfishness, choosing the lesser good than the true good. If we see the fall as the introduction of selfishness into this physical world, obviously Satan had it, but he's not the manager. If our managers chose selfishness and that consequence has reverberations, well, now predatory behavior acts as a check on the selfishness of herbivorous animals, who otherwise the world of plants is in for a bad hit. So one area that Young Earth Creationists, I think the ones who have thought through these issues rather well, think about this is, this is good in a fallen world, but there may be better. And again, eschatologically, it seems like better is out ahead of us in terms of the interactions of animals in the world.
Further thoughts, Fuzz?
Yeah, well, just with respect to Psalm 104, because I think that's a really critical passage of Scripture as we try to adjudicate this issue, is I've spent probably 30 years studying Psalm 104. It's just a fascinating passage of Scripture to me. But it is a creation account. That would be our position. And it's the position, I think, of other commentators, not just Reasons to Believe. But it's interesting because different portions of Psalm 104 correspond to the different days of Genesis 1. But one of the things that's emphasized in Psalm 104 is God's providence. And what you begin to see as you read through that passage carefully, or that psalm carefully, is that what God is doing on one day of creation is providentially setting the stage for the second day of creation. And I think some of the references that you see to the contemporary world of the psalmist at that time, maybe David, is in reference to this idea of providence, that what God did on the second day and the third day of creation is actually something that is providentially experienced today. So it's not only a purposeful progression for the days of creation, but it's also part of God's providential care, that what he's done as creator is something that we can enjoy and experience today.
I think that's a really good point in the way that, and I agree, the psalm, of course, is following along thematically with Genesis 1. Young Earth creation perspective is going to see a little bit of a hinge in those contentious verses about the waters getting a boundary. And of course, from RTB's standpoint, that is talking about what's going on in the creation week.
Yeah.
And as a Young Earth creationist, I think that verse is pulling double duty. It's thematically connected to day 3 when the waters are split, but it is also referring to actually when God says, I'll never do a flood again, references to mountains. And so then moving on, so I kind of see it also not only as thematically connected to Genesis 1, but temporally moving us from creation to the flood to the world of the psalmist. And that gives me a different perspective a little bit on what's going on with those carnivory passages and things like that, and why we're in the world of the psalmist. And I think he's bringing us from creation all the way through to where he is then.
Interesting.
Fuzz, how about the question of why should I believe the biblical story from a scientific point of view? Is there any science behind all this?
Yeah, well, I would like to say that there's a scientific case that could be made for a historical Adam and Eve. I don't think you could do that today. But, I mean, there are some provocative ideas like mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosomal Adam that are suggestive of the biblical story, but I think you would be hard-pressed to push that to saying that these are the biblical Adam and Eve. But I also think it's very clear when you look at the methods that are used to estimate original population sizes and things like that, that there's nothing in the science that rules out a historical Adam and Eve. And I'm not going to get into the technical details here. We can. But also, this is something we've pointed out in Who Was Adam and elsewhere, is that the methods that are used by population geneticists to estimate population sizes of human beings, I think are suspect in terms of providing really clear, definitive numbers for the original population sizes. Because when you use those methods in conservation biology, and this is published in the literature, those methods break down quite often. And so I'm not sure that the science can rule out a historical Adam and Eve. I think you would be hard-pressed to make a case for that. But something that is interesting is that there is a growing recognition among anthropologists for human exceptionalism, where they see anatomically and behaviorally modern humans as exceptional, even compared to Neanderthals. And what they believe makes us different in kind, not different in degree, is our qualities that we could understand as being reflecting the image of God, if you take a resemblance view for the image of God. So I think you can actually make a really strong scientific case for human beings bearing God's image that hinges on human exceptionalism and connecting that to the image of God. But you can't, I don't think, make a corresponding strong scientific case for a historical Adam and Eve. But again, the science doesn't rule it out.
Those are some really interesting thoughts on that, Fuzz. Thanks. Yeah, as a paleontologist, my area of discipline is in the historical sciences. We're trying to infer the events of the past based on the evidence that we have here in the present. And as a result, it's going to be really hard to say that a particular two people lived at a certain time in the past. For that, you need records, you need documentation or things like that. And so I appreciate you talking about some of the questions about these population genetics issues, because these are the ones used primarily by some of our theistic evolution brothers and sisters and some of our agnostic and atheist fellow scientists to say that Adam and Eve could not exist. Now, those, importantly, are focused on the Homo sapiens species only, and locating Adam and Eve, I think, in Homo sapiens alone ends up being scientifically problematic, because while I recognize, sure, there's some interesting discussion on human exceptionalism, there's also a massive growing body of those who find that there is Neanderthal exceptionalism, if I could borrow the phrase, and apply, and a growing appreciation for the intellect and capacities of Neanderthals as a different species classically understood than Homo sapiens, to the point where someone like Bill Craig decides, the evidence tips in the favor, and I think, he would say, I think Neanderthals are human, and so the reason he puts Adam 750,000 years ago is if we're human and they're human, then the common ancestor of us both must be human as well.
Right.
And that's an interesting place where Bill Craig and Young Earth Creationists ended up in a similar spot, because Young Earth Creationists have been saying literally now for over a century that Neanderthals were human. I found that out as I was writing my chapter for this book, Perspectives on the Historical Adam, and I was like, how far back can we go in Young Earth Creationism? Anybody saying this? So I had a copy of George McCready Price's The New Geology from 1921, and I cracked it open and found, a mention of Neanderthals, and I go over to the page, and he's talking about La Chapelle-aux-Saints, which is a Neanderthal that seemed to have been buried inside of a cave, and we find now evidence of excavations on the side of where the body was placed and infill, so it was definitely a deliberate placement of the body. And George McCready Price, writing in 1921, when the skeleton is probably only about 30 years old or so, it's still pretty fresh science, says it looks like this fellow was buried there by his friends. Chimpanzees don't have friends quite the same way that you and I might talk about that sort of thing. So I find it fascinating that Young Earth Creationists had looked at Neanderthals and said there's something about them that looks quite human, and their behavior looks quite human. And that would be something that we go through Young Earth Creationism into the 1960s, into the 90s, into today, and would say, yes, Neanderthals actually have been, our understanding of Neanderthals have been growing in their level of exceptionalism, such that they seem, I think, at least to me, to be the cognitive equivalents of any Homo sapiens at the same strata in geology.
Well, Marcus and I were talking, I guess, in the infamous Zoom call. And it's funny because the whole issue of Neanderthals, believe it or not, is linchpin issue among different models for how you understand, who Adam and Eve were relative to the hominins. And I think RTB is increasingly becoming an outlier in viewing Neanderthals as being distinct from humans, but I think the data actually is in our favor. Now, I would agree, Marcus, that there is this push towards Neanderthal exceptionalism among anthropologists, and there are studies of the archaeological record where people interpret the finds as, look, Neanderthals were very much like us. But there are also other studies that challenge those interpretations. So I think when you look at the archaeological evidence, I think the best you can say today is that it's disputed from the archaeological evidence as to what Neanderthal capabilities were. What to me is compelling is, and again, this is from an Old Earth perspective, you may not find it compelling from a Young Earth perspective, but when you look at the trajectory of technology, Neanderthals were on Earth longer than we have been on Earth as modern humans. Their technology remained largely static. Modern humans appear on the scene. Our technology is primitive at the onset, but within a relatively short period of time, we actually have a technology that explodes to the point where we were able to put people on the moon, right? And we're now contemplating using techniques in science to create novel, artificial, non-natural life forms. There's got to be something fundamentally different between humans and Neanderthals to explain that. And, also we're learning quite a bit about Neanderthal biology, remarkably so. And, Neanderthals had a brain size that was probably larger than ours, but their encephalization quotient, or the brain size to body mass, was slightly smaller. But the brain shape of Neanderthals is clearly different. The Neanderthals have a distinct skull compared to modern humans. We actually, as modern humans, are outliers in that we have a globular skull and a flat face. Neanderthals had an elongated skull, and the implications of this is that Neanderthals would have had a reduced parietal lobe compared to humans, a reduced temporal lobe. Their orbits, or the eye sockets, are larger than humans. That's significant because there's a correlation between orbit size and the area of the brain devoted to visual processing. So more of the Neanderthal brain would have been devoted to visual processing than our brain. And so collectively, this seems to suggest cognitive differences and perhaps cognitive inferiority. We have the Neanderthal genome, and in that genome, there's 100 genes that are different. And some of those are involved in neural development or implicated in neuropsychiatric disorders in modern humans. And when people have created these brain organoids that have been Neanderthalized using some of these genetic differences in these types of genes, they actually see what appears to be physiological differences that suggest, again, a cognitive inferiority. So when you put that all together, I think a case can be made that Neanderthals really are distinct from us, that they didn't have our capabilities. I think it's still an outstanding question, but I think the evidence is pushing people in the direction, if you evaluate it fairly, to seeing really fundamental distinctions between humans and Neanderthals, that Neanderthals really are not like us.
Well, I guess you'd be right in saying that I don't find those compelling, but you bring out a lot of interesting challenges here. And one of the things I would say about the modern biological methods of encephalization using Neanderthal encoded material is we really don't know what we're doing when we're doing this, right? We're doing these kind of oddball, I hate to say Frankenstein kind of experiments with things in order to see what happens, but we don't have a Neanderthal brain as an actual model, right? And so we're trying to see what happens to a mouse brain or something when we introduce these sorts of things. So I would say then we have to adjudicate the question based on the record of the Neanderthals and the record of the materials and the cultural artifacts that they left behind. And I'll preface this first by addressing the question of their technological change. From a Young Earth creation perspective, I'm looking at this as post-flood, right? So I'm not looking at this as happening over an extended period of hundreds of thousands of years. This is happening in hundreds or thousands of years, depending on how close or tightly we take those genealogies. And so I don't think that this is actually a long period of stagnation, for example, or that even the erectine use of hand axes and choppers is actually all that long. It's the initial materials you can find as people are spreading out over the earth into a world that they've never seen and been in before. And so what do? Well, we have a lot of TV show games where people end up on an island by themselves, trying to hack it out like a primitive. And what do? You get a sharp rock as fast as you can, and you might have that for quite a while before you figure out something better to do. So with the Neanderthals, when we start looking at their tool industries, when we start looking at the products of their homes, knowing that they're living in family clusters and groups and whatnot, we find that they're making things ultimately like glue, which is phenomenal. There's a really interesting paper about how Neanderthals were burying some sort of container or heating that container in an area with very, very low oxygen in order to pull out saps and create a glue to which they would affix their points to the spears. The contemporary Homo sapiens weren't doing that. They're using cordage and they're tying them on. But these guys, Uncle Thag's got a chemistry kit, and they're figuring out a way to physically affix with glue. That is tremendously, intellectual activity, to think about what materials do I need, how do I construct an apparatus, how do I keep air out of this thing while it boils and steeps and ferments or what have you. And we see them also using cordage as well, right? A couple of years ago, there was the discovery of this tiny little fragment in a Neanderthal cave. It was only about a centimeter or so, but it was a 3-ply cord that was taken from wood fibers from nearby trees that were pulled and stripped and then wound together, and then 3 of them were wound in the opposite helical direction in order to make twine. And the mental capabilities to foresee that type of material, I think, are the cognitive equivalent of any human being walking around today. I don't know how to make twine, right? I've used it, sure, and as a kid you pull it all apart, but could I actually figure out how to make it on my own? No. So when I look at the anthropological record of Neanderthals and also see that they were getting to places like Crete and other islands in the Mediterranean that have no land-based connection to the rest of Europe, they're getting in boats and apparently convincing a whole bunch of their tribe members that getting on a boat and going over here is a good idea, right? That's going to involve lots of language, communication of a high level, because once you get out on the ocean, or the Mediterranean Sea, right? It's a dangerous place. And you need a lot of intellect to be able to do that. So when I look at the Neanderthal skull, and I agree with you, right? Humans are the outliers. Modern humans are the outliers. We've got this bowling ball-shaped head. Everybody else has got a football. In a sense, I look at us as moderns and see a lot of juvenile traits, what we call in biology paedomorphism, which is when juvenile traits are retained later into adult forms. And actually that might be neoteny. There's neoteny and paedomorphism. They're 2 sides of the same coin. Do you become an adult soon when you're still a kid, or do you hold on to kid physical features into an extended adult feature? And when you look at a small kid, or when you look at a puppy or a kitten, what are the features that you see? Big head, round chubby cheeks, and all these sorts of features. And Stephen Jay Gould, the great communicator of evolution, had this magnificent article called The Evolution of Mickey Mouse, where he detailed how Mickey, as a cartoon character, became more and more childish over time. Starting off with Steamboat Willie, where he's really mischievous. I mean, the early days of Mickey, he's a nasty character. He's not nice. He's beating on Minnie and scaring her half to death, and like things that you can't show kids on TV these days. But his physical form changed into something softer, smaller, cuter, more juvenile. And there's quite a lot about our physical form that, to me, seems to evince a juvenile set of features compared to Neanderthals, erectines, etc. And speculation, but I wonder about the change in lifespan and what that means. That if Adam saw us today, if he wouldn't look at you and me and say, dude, what's with your head? What happened to you guys? Because from a young Earth creation perspective, I think we are open to Adam's physical form being something other than Homo sapiens. Most young Earth creationists will think it's us, and that Neanderthals and Erectines are offshoots. They're diseased, or they have some sort of genetic problem. But given the stratigraphic distribution and finding Erectines before Neanderthals, before us, makes me wonder whether or not in the post-flood world, actually, we have a broadly speaking Erectine morphology that eventually morphs into something like us.
Fuzz, brief comments, and we'll move to questions.
Yeah. Well, with respect to the hafting material and the twine, there's podcasts and articles that we've written to respond to that. So, but with regard to this idea of neonateny and padiomorphism, I mean, we actually have Neanderthal specimens that go from infanthood to adulthood. And so you can actually look at the developmental trajectory of Neanderthal, growth.
Yeah.
And they had a brain size that was, at birth, humans and Neanderthals have very similar brain skull shapes and brain sizes. And very quickly during development, Neanderthals acquire this, as you said, the football-shaped the skull. And, and so this looks like it is an inherent difference between humans and Neanderthals based on that developmental trajectory. Also, the data seems to indicate that Neanderthals very quickly pass through any kind of teenage years, puberty, into adulthood much more quickly than modern humans did. And you can tell this from microanatomical features on the teeth of Neanderthals compared to modern humans. So there does appear to be developmental differences that seem to be inherent. So not so sure that the padiomorphism model works.
And let me clarify, I'm not trying to make the argument that modern Homo sapiens are padomorphic Neanderthals. I would say that we were definitely different people groups that had their own trajectories. I just look at us and see a lot of padomorphic types of features that we might have gotten from, I think, our post-flood ancestors. So just so the audience is clear, I'm not saying we are Neanderthals that became baby people, sort of thing. But yeah.
Okay, we're going to move to the question period. Put your question in the chat. Make sure it's a question. Make sure it's concise. We have a couple questions now. A question from Steve. This is regarding the statement that the creation was good or very good. Marcus, how do you respond to that? Some people would say it doesn't say perfect, so is it possible that could include death before the fall?
Well, thankfully, we talked a little bit about this already. So, I think that it's very important that we distinguish good from perfect. God doesn't say it was perfect. He said that it was good, which means that the creation is functioning according to his intentions, at each step of the way. And of course, in Genesis 1, we have 6 statements of it was good, and then one final 7th important biblical number, right, of it was very good. And it's interesting to see those play out because, for example, on day 2, there is no statement that it is good. And I think that's in part because the seas hadn't been named yet, the waters that had been separated. We hadn't quite finished out the whole separation process. So as a young Earth creationist, I want us to be rather careful to say that when we say God said it was good, we're not talking about a perfect world. This is a physical world that is constrained by physical rules and laws, and so perfection is something that exists only in the Trinity. And this world works properly. It does what God intends it to do. If that includes death, certainly, again, some death, apoptosis, plant death as far as the fuel for the world, and animal death, again, I suspect not, but possible, and certainly a perspective that's been held in the Christian tradition.
Buzz?
Yeah, well, I mean, the Hebrew word that's translated as good is tov, and as Marcus points out, it can mean good, it can mean beautiful, and it can be made as intended. And so that's how I would read. And so from my perspective, I see animal death as part of that good creation. It's part of what was made as intended. If I want to bring up this point, if I could, and be very curious to see your interaction with this idea. Oftentimes I find that young Earth creationists are very troubled by the idea that animal death could be part of a good creation. And here I think they're thinking of the concept of good as not made as intended, but something other than that. Mm-hmm. But the argument is, well, this seems to impugn God's character. How could a God who's all powerful and all knowing and all good create a world where there's animal death that's part of it, right? And to me, I don't know that by arguing that animal death happened as a result of the fall, that you somehow get God out of the dock, because whether God created the world this way or cursed the world, either way, God is ultimately responsible for animal death, whether it's part of the creation or part of the curse. And from my perspective, I see that when you adopt the view that is part of the creation, you're retaining God's sovereignty, right? Because if God is creating a world, and then as a result of the fall, we now are in a world that's not as intended, right? But this is a curse that God has been forced to execute because of Adam's rebellion. Then is God really sovereign, right? Or is God in control of the situation? So I see, the concept of God's sovereignty actually being retained by seeing the animal death happening as a result of the creation, not as a result of the fall.
Any comments?
Interesting perspective. Thanks for sharing that. When I see the curse on the serpent being more than all other beasts of the field, that is one of those things that I think the Bible is hinting at, this extension of the curse out into the rest of the created economy. And in particular, in this case, the beast of the field, right, the behemoth, et cetera. And so from that, I get the feeling, at least, that this is where carnivory comes in, that this is part of it all, as we talked about with, what would happen when sin and when selfishness is introduced. I don't think in either case it impugns God's goodness if he created a world in which there was animal death, because there already is certain other kinds of death around, again, plant and internal to an organism death. But with God's emphasis on life, and that God is himself the life of all things, having God create creatures who, including us, who would have been, who would have died had it not been, say, for the tree of life in there. I don't see that as a likely situation. I see God's character in life as one that extends out into those animal worlds and the sort of things where you see his care, even in, of course, the account of Jonah, right? And Jonah's all upset. Well, God obviously cared about the animals. He cared for them to live. So yeah, I want Young Earth Creationists to keep their options open, and yet I do think that we have probably better hints that there wasn't this kind of substantial organism death before the fall.
Okay, I'm going to put you to work here. I'm going to ask you to keep your comments concise, because there are a lot of really good questions.
Okay.
All right.
That people
It's the
wanna
lightning
ask.
round.
So here's a question from Roger. He's looking at day 6, and he says there's a lot of things happening in that day, and in his mind, it's hard to reconcile all that happens to Adam and Eve in a 24-hour period.
Okay, yeah, it's a great question, and a lot of it is going to hinge on how many animals does Adam have to name. If we consider something like the species as the created kind, then Adam would still be naming things today. He'd be busy. There are millions of species. So on the other hand, what does God do? He brings the beasts of the field, the birds of the sky. He brings representatives of these kinds. And so if the kinds are a more limited group, they're not everything out in creation, but they're the kinds, and they're not fish and not a bunch of other things. Then Adam can spend a very fruitful morning naming things. This is his role as image bearers. God calls things on the first 3 days of creation. He calls nothing on the second 3 days of creation, and Adam gets the responsibility to call when he is made. So I don't see that actually as taking all that much time as he is looking around and naming the things that God has brought to him in the garden. And that gives plenty of time for him to realize none of these things look like me. God allows him a brief sleep while he performs a new creation from him. So honestly, as a young earth creationist, I've never found that to be a really troubling argument.
Any response, Fuzz?
Yeah, well, I mean, very quickly, this is one of the arguments that Gleason Archer made about why he thought day must be a period of time as opposed to 24 hours, is to have compatibility between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. And it's not just naming the animals, but, Adam is created and there is no garden, and God causes the garden to grow. And there's nothing in the text that seems to indicate that this was some kind of supernatural accelerated growth process. It looks as if it was a natural process. Adam's placed in the garden to work the garden, and that implies a period of time in order to execute the tasks you would need to maintain the garden. And then the process of naming the animals is significant because it means Adam had authority over the animals, but also he had to study them to recognize that none were like them. Because remember, the animals are made from the dust of the earth just like Adam is. And so the only difference is Adam receives the divine breath, the animals don't. And so there would be, I think, a temptation on Adam's part to think, well, they're made out of the same stuff as me. These must be suitable as helpmates. And so it's that process of studying them. So it's not just naming them, but it's also studying them to recognize that none are like them. So in my mind, that's a lot that you would have to fit into a part of a 24-hour period of time.
Question here from Ken Wolgamuth, friend of all of ours.
Yeah.
He says, as a paleontologist, how did the biosphere recover so quickly after these 5 extinction events? And he lists them, and I'm not sure I can pronounce them. So,
Good. Shout out to Ken. Good to have you listening to us today. So from a young Earth creation perspective, these 5 extinction events, which are all at different points in the geological column, so the names like Devonian and Cretaceous and Ordovician that you see on the screen there are all different layers, and typically there's an extinction like at the end of it that we then see a different group of fauna after that. From a young Earth creation perspective, these extinction events are occurring during Noah's flood. So these would be points, as far as I would understand them, as points in which the floodwaters had overwhelmed a particular ecosystem and were now transitioning into another substantially different kind of ecosystem. And so they're not extinctions in the same way that an old Earth advocate or theistic evolutionist would look at them. They're not everything got wiped out and then there were these new creations or there was this new evolution, whichever model. This would be from a young Earth creation perspective where the flood is advancing and wiping out groups, where there seems to be some sort of strong differentiation between the ecosystem in this location and the ecosystem in another.
okay, question. From an evolutionary standpoint, how complete is the fossil record connecting apes to modern humans?
I would say not very complete, to answer the question quickly. I mean, one of the things that is interesting, number one, is that, we have hominin fossils to begin with. That's a huge scientific achievement in my mind. And the fossil record is sparse, even though we do have, a large number of hominin species to work with. But I would argue that it's incomplete, and it's incomplete in such a way that we're not able to establish robust relationships from an evolutionary perspective of how the different hominins relate to each other. There's a lot of controversy about how many hominin species there actually are, and that gets into the lumper and splitter controversy. But it's impossible at this point to draw a clear pathway through the hominin fossil record that goes from some hypothetical ape-like creature. So we would start with maybe Ardipithecus ramidus and go forward and produce a definitive pathway that actually would show an evolution of modern humans. And many of the hominins that were thought to be part of that Bronsky ascent of man imagery that we're all familiar with are actually evolutionary side branches and dead ends, Neanderthals would be one example. The transition between the Australopithecines and the Homo genus is completely unknown. There's so much speculation, it's almost embarrassing in terms of how that transition would have happened.
Response?
Yeah, certainly the record of humans is far less complete than it is for certain other types of creatures that we might be interested in. My own advisor one time, was talking, he was a paleontologist, studied dinosaurs and other sorts of things, and we were just kind of talking about how we're glad actually we're not in this area because just, man, there wasn't a whole lot to work with, and that was, in the early 2000s. Since then, there has been a substantial renaissance in paleoanthropology, a lot of new species, a lot of new discoveries, and yet some of these big gaps or separations are still there. I agree entirely with Fuzz about, between the Australopithecines and Homo, there seems to be this substantial gap with a couple of weird things that we don't even know what to do with on them. And then there's a couple other places where there's gaps. But as a young Earth creationist, I actually think that it's probably fairly complete as far as the record goes. There's plenty of places where we don't have fossils and whatnot. There was a good paper earlier this year about, we don't have fossils from large sections of Africa. We focus mostly on East African Rift because that's where the sedimentation rates were high. This is where the preservation happens. But there are hominids all over the continent. We don't have very many of them. But from a young Earth creation standpoint, looking at this, I would affirm Homo erectus on up, very likely, as all members of humanity, and this is part of the recolonization after the flood, and that significant separation between Homo and Australopithecines, to me, is a good indicator of in baraminology and studying these clusters of who clusters with whom. The Australopithecines are never, really in that cluster with Homo, except for one member, but those are juveniles, and I think they might be kind of skewing the data.
Okay, I want to tell our audience that we are going to extend our program, our live stream, by 10 minutes. So,
all right,
some
bonus
good
round.
questions coming in. Marcus, this is a question for you. I think you've touched on this a little bit, but the question is, are you saying that God created an imperfect world?
I would say that God created a world that has constraints. Yes, everything that God created physically is imperfect because, again, only God in the form of the Trinity is perfect. So, yes, God created an imperfect world, but he created a good world, and he created a world that has to operate within the parameters of this particular universe. There will always be constraints as a result.
Fuzz, a question from Philip. Who do you think were the men painting the caves?
I see those as modern humans, anatomically and behaviorally modern humans. There are claims that Neanderthals are responsible for some of that art, but when you press into the evidence that is in support of that, the claims don't withstand the scrutiny of the evidence. So, modern humans.
Your perspective?
Well, it would certainly depend on what caves we're looking at, and
Okay.
so I'll pass on that one aside to say that we do know that Neanderthals were using pigments for a variety of purposes, including what seemed to be adornment of themselves, which in my mind qualifies as artwork. And we do have what's been called the Neanderthal hashtag, right? This carving into a limestone wall that was symbolic of some set that is associated with Neanderthal remains. But we don't have any of those beautiful cave paintings of the horses and whatnot like we see amongst later Homo sapiens. So
And he does mention Kosker, Chauvet.
okay.
Yeah, those would be modern human sites.
Okay, a question from Jonathan. How do you reconcile a historical Adam and Eve and their offspring being incestuous despite God's forbidding this act in Leviticus 18:7? Can Genesis 1 through 11 be mytho-historical?
So a challenge for both of us, since in this respect, the Young Earth and the Old Earth models both start off with a original pair, and we don't have a group outside that we say we're mating with, like a genealogical Adam view or either recent or ancient. So I would say that when God first created Adam and Eve, that He created them with a genetic composition that didn't have a whole bunch of, it wasn't saddled with a whole bunch of genetic mutations. The trouble that we run into, and Fuzz knows this better than me, so I'll say it quick, and he can do details. But the reason why we have problems with incestuous relationships genetically is because close relations typically have the same points of genetic fault. And so when you put those together and you don't have a good copy of a gene, but you only have bad copies of a gene, then the kid has some sort of genetic abnormality for that. Now, I think it's instructive also biblically that the injunctive against close sibling marriage doesn't happen until the law. Because when we look at Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, they all had very close relations. I mean, Abraham, his half-sister, was Sarah. This also might give us a reason for why they had trouble having children. But it was not something that was against the law or against God's desire. But by the time we get to the Israelite community, he says, I think we're far enough in human history now where this is dangerous, and so he institutes a law of grace to instruct us that this is going to be problematic. Don't do it.
I would answer the question almost identically to
All
Marcus.
right.
Very good. Julia asks, you mentioned Augustine earlier, and I'm glad you did. He's my favorite Christian thinker. And his belief in God creating instantaneously. The question is, why does instantaneous creation require a young earth view?
Good question. In Augustine's conception, it did. I don't know that instantaneous creation requires a young earth or not. It kind of depends on what you think, how you're taking the text of Genesis 1. Augustine was heavily burdened by kind of a mistranslation or over-translation of Genesis 2 of these are the generations of the heavens of the earth on the day that God created them. And as he read that in Latin, it overemphasized the point of day. In Hebrew, this is the construction beyom, which means of day. And frequently we'll see in our own modern translations that this is translated as when. In the Old King James, it's in the day of, but modern Hebrew scholars recognize that beyom basically just means when something is created. So Augustine ran into this problem of it read to him like everything was made in a single day, and so he had to do something with the 7 days of creation before that. And so he labored over years in multiple writings, right? 3 times working on commentaries on Genesis to come up with an approach to say this is a revelatory analogy, if you will, to the angels about what was happening instantaneously. But because the creation begins with Adam and then Eve, right, everything happening in the garden, his view of history begins with humans, and he would have taken the genealogies as more or less a series of historical connection points only a few thousand years ago. So that's why I would say that Augustine held to a young earth creation perspective, even though he doesn't hold to the modern 6 days or 6 days things. That's honestly not why I'm a young earth creationist. I'm a young earth creationist in part for those, but mostly because of, I think, genealogies are connecting us, and therefore if we end up with days, or at least Adam, whether you take the days as literal days or something like Augustine, you still end up with a young earth.
Okay, a question from Neil. Both Big Bang cosmology and vast oil, and they have vast oil and natural gas deposits in Earth. Does this argue for an old Earth? How do each of you respond to that? Fuzz.
Well, I would just say the biodeposits that we see in the earth are the result of a vast history of life and death on the earth. So
Okay.
that I see that as evidence for an old earth.
Yeah, a young earth creationist would look at those biodeposits, particularly the oil and gas, which would have been produced by plankton, for example, and the coal that was made from various types of trees, as primarily formed during the flood. It kind of depends on where you end the flood and get into the post-flood world as to what coal deposits count. But all the stuff where I live in the Appalachians would be considered coal from the flood, whereas maybe some of the more recent deposits of lignites in the Gulf or things like that would be considered post-flood catastrophes that destroyed forested areas. But I will say that this is actually a pretty strong challenge to a young Earth creation because there is a significant quantity of these materials out there. I'm not as concerned with limestones. That's another one of these biomaterials, but I think that a lot of those are probably remobilized materials from the pre-flood world. So,
Okay, Stephen has a question. I think maybe we can bring into both of you giving kind of a brief summary before we close because our time's moving ahead. But Stephen asked the question, what would it take to convince you that your view on the age of the Earth is wrong?
I'll take that one. It's frequently posed to young Earth creationists in particular, with the arguments from Big Bang cosmology, geology, etc. As I worked on this book, Perspectives on the Historical Adam and Eve, I actually went to the commentaries and to the writings of our theologically trained brothers and sisters with a lot of trepidation. I was quite concerned that my interpretation of Genesis as supportive of a young Earth would be shown to be quite naive. And because that's often a claim that's made that we take an overly literal or overly literalistic view of the Bible. I don't like those terms. That usually just means that you read the Bible a little bit more in this direction than I do, and so I'm going to use this pejorative. But as I went to the commentaries and read from Rana and Wenham and read from both evangelicals and non-evangelicals and across Jack Collins and many others, I was actually quite surprised at the arguments against young Earth creationism not being anywhere near as strong as I thought that they would be. I was really thinking I was going to get hit hard, and there are some good challenges to young Earth creationism theologically, but I found that actually young Earth creationism as a stronger and more nuanced position could actually absorb most of those quite easily. And so if someone could convince me that the Bible, I think, allows for an ancient age, if you look at someone like John Walton's view, and he says it's not even talking about history at all, and you and I would both disagree with that quite strongly. I was trying my best to be quite open to interpretations and seeing the strength of them. And so, what data from the sciences? There could be some. I really am of the opinion that we should give young Earth creationism a really hard go at it. And I'm going to hold back and say I think that scripturally I'm on really solid footing with this position. And I think that a lot of what young Earth creationism has done has mostly been, targeting evolutionary arguments and uniformitarianism. We need the time to build our own house and to build it very well. And on my part, I don't think that I could be convinced of an ancient Earth right now from the science. But on the other hand, if we continue to run up against walls, maybe. But I think that the scriptural case is even stronger than what most young Earth creationists believe it to be.
Fuzz, you got 30 seconds.
Okay, well,
Sorry, Fuzz.
no problem, Marcus. When I first became a Christian and I looked at Genesis 1, I intuitively saw day as a period of time. But as I began to grow as a Christian and was exposed to young Earth readings of Genesis 1, I thought, this makes sense, but I still think that the Scripture allows for an Old Earth perspective. But over the last 30 years, as I've really studied these issues, I become more and more convinced that the best reading of Genesis 1 is actually an Old Earth reading. When you look at the totality of all the creation accounts in Scripture, to me it makes the most sense. So I'm convinced that what Scripture is teaching is indeed an Old Earth. And I just think there is just a preponderance of evidence for the antiquity of the universe and the antiquity of the Earth. And, whenever I've looked at, I'm not a geologist or an astronomer, but when I've looked at arguments made by young Earth creationists from a scientific perspective, in areas that I have a good grasp of. I understand radiometric dating pretty well with a background in chemistry, or I've done work on the idea that there's soft tissue remnants in fossils. Here I see the young Earth challenges that on the surface seem compelling to as you dig into it, to really lose their teeth. So I would be hard-pressed, I think, to really change my views. Not that I'm closed-minded, I just think that the evidence is really that strong biblically and scientifically for an old earth.
Okay, we are moving toward the end of our program. Marcus and Fuzz, thanks so much for your time, your contribution. Marcus, how can people get in connection with you?
Well, thank you, and thanks so much for balancing all this out. This was a wonderful time. I really appreciated the opportunity to join and to hear from your watchers and listeners. If people are interested in finding out more about what we do, they can visit Cornerstone Educational Supply. That's at cornerstone-edsupply.com. And we got a contact button on there, so if somebody wants to send a message over to me and say, great job, or, hey, try again next time, they can go ahead and do that. And certainly if they're looking for science materials for their Christian schools or their homeschool co-op or interested in things like that, we would, love to help them out.
Okay, I want to thank our audience for participating in our live stream. These were really great questions. You can put a comment down below about the program. And I want to invite all of you that we're going to do more of these in the future. And we believe that this gives Christians an opportunity to talk with each other, to express respect to each other, but also tenaciously disagree. So we're glad that you have been with us, and we'll see you again. Bye-bye.